You're with Bhekisisa's Health Beat. I'm Malan and we're discussing the links between poor water maintenance and our health. With me is infectious diseases specialist Tom Boyles, who works for the organisation Right to Care. Tom, thanks for joining us today. What are the links between infectious diseases and dirty water?
There are so many links that I probably would divide it up into the kind of pathogens that can be spread by water. We often start with the small ones, which are viruses. And so hepatitis A and hepatitis E, which people may have heard of, are spread by water. And then bacteria. So people have heard of E. coli, things like typhoid and cholera, which has been recently in the news, a number of other bacteria. And then slightly larger organisms, sometimes free-living ones like amoebae can cause things like amoebic dysentery. And essentially, these organisms, most of the organisms I've discussed, are present in the gut of either a human, sometimes an animal, and it comes out in stool. And if that stool contaminates water that somebody then drinks, then they will become at risk of becoming infected with that organism. Some of the organisms live freely in the environment, but largely it's something that's essentially come from the gut of one person or an animal into the mouth through drinking water, causing the disease.
So there's clearly a lot of diseases that we can get from dirty water. And one of those that we saw in South Africa this year is cholera. How likely is it that the source of cholera in places like Hammanskraal, where the municipality provides water trucks with drinking water, how likely is it that the source of cholera is in that water that was perhaps not cleaned properly?
It seems likely that people were drinking water, a number of people were drinking a same source of water that was contaminated. So you have to think on first principles that the trucks that were provided were the source. Now, I don't know if there's evidence to prove that, but you certainly would make that assumption to begin with. That would be the first place you would look. Cholera can spread from person to person. So, like I said, it really has to be the stool of one person getting into the mouth of another. It doesn't have to go through the water cycle. It can be if you're caring for somebody with cholera, and they've got profuse diarrhea, you can get cholera. But I don't think that would be enough to explain this large outbreak.
So if we continue to not clean South Africa's water properly, and if we continue to deprive so many communities of clean running water, what does the future of diseases that you get through water look like?
Well, it's bleak, isn't it? Because we see this in other countries. There was a large cholera outbreak in Malawi, which has a poor water infrastructure, with hundreds of people dying. And once the bacteria is in circulation, like I said, there'll be people with mild symptoms passing it through stool. If that water isn't cleaned before it's drunk, then that's where you get an outbreak. And like I said, we're focusing on cholera, but essentially the same mechanism is true for a whole range of illnesses and organisms. And so if our water system deteriorates further, or people have no access to any clean potable water, then we're going to see more of this.
Now, our Constitution says access to clean water is a human right, but how aware are people of this right? And is anyone listening?
Not in my experience. I mean, as you know, I've lived in urban and rural areas, and rural areas that may have one or two taps in the village. That's it. This is in rural South Africa, and so people collect river water and rainwater. Typically, rainwater is great if people can afford rain tanks, but the rain tanks run dry, and people collect river water. And where there also are very few toilet facilities, then the link is obvious that if people are emptying their bowels near a river source, the pathogens are going to get into that water source, and if you drink that water from the river without cleaning it, then you're going to get disease. Of course, educating people about this is important because if you have the resources to boil that water for 2 minutes and cool it down and then drink it, then the pathogens will all be killed. But firstly, people need to be aware of that, and secondly, they need the fuel and the time to boil water and cool it down before they drink it.
Tom, with climate change, we see the earth getting warmer, and we also get some diseases that's not transmitted through drinking water, but that's transmitted through things like freshwater snails in water sources in local areas like where you've worked. Now, what does climate change and the increased temperatures mean for where we see those diseases?
So we're thinking of the condition called schistosomiasis, also known as bilharzia, which is actually a worm infection, which you don't get from drinking the water, you get it from bathing or swimming in the water. And this is very common in a belt of South Africa from the Eastern Cape all the way up the coast into Mpumalanga and Limpopo, where in some cases well over half of the school-aged children have this condition. And it's dependent on a cycle of a human and a snail. And you need to have both. You need to have the human, the snail, and the parasite to make the cycle. So in the Western Cape, there's no snails because the climate isn't right, so there's no schistosomiasis, bilharzia. But as climate increases, then the range that the snails can live on will likely shift. Malawi had a cholera outbreak, and then they had a cyclone, likely linked to human activity, climate change. And that disrupts water supplies by definition. And you get bigger runoff, any pathogens that are in soil will more likely to make it into a water source.
Thanks, Tom Boyles.